Somewhere in the files of the San Francisco Police Department, there's a report that accurately foretold the resolution to an occult mystery. It runs about 10 pages. It was written in February 1981, and it predicts, down to the day, when a dead man's missing head would resurface. Work out the arithmetic inside it, and you land on a single date, March 22nd. The two officers who wrote it were laughed at inside their own department. Then March 22nd arrived, and in the weeds beside a small lake in Golden Gate Park, so did the head. Leroy Carter Jr. was 29 years old, born in Louisiana in September 1951. He'd served in Nam as a young man, and when that chapter closed, he drifted west and ended up in San Francisco without much to his name. By the winter of 1981, he was homeless, living out of a backpack and a sleeping bag near the blocks where Haight Street runs into Stanyon, at the eastern edge of Golden Gate Park. The Haight in 1981 wasn't the Haight of the hippies anymore, and things had taken a turn for the sinister. The neighborhood had spent the 70s sliding into cheap rents and hard drugs, and the park's eastern entrance had turned into a kind of open-air encampment. Alvord Lake sits just inside that entrance, a shallow, murky pond ringed by brush, close enough to the street that you can hear the traffic. It's small enough that most visitors walk past without ever learning its name, but for the men who slept there, the brush around it offered something rare in a city, a place to be invisible. Carter had been arrested a handful of times over the years, small stuff mostly, the kind of record that tends to accumulate when you're surviving outdoors. Those minor arrests would play a big role in this cold case because they put his fingerprints on file with the local police department. Without them, the city might never have learned who he was, and he may have simply been registered as one of California's many John Doe cases. On Sunday, February 8, 1981, a young woman near the park's edge came across a blood-stained tan backpack with a black coat and 2 shirts inside, and she turned it into the police. A patrol officer responded shortly after noon and began checking the brush just south of Alvord Lake. What he found there was a blue sleeping bag with a man still inside it, and to his horror, the man's head was gone. It wasn't anywhere at the scene, and whoever took it had carried it out of one of the most visited city parks in America without being seen. The deputy coroner who examined the body described the cut as very clean, the way it would look if an expert had done it, and investigators speculated about a sharp axe. A police sergeant told reporters that Carter appeared to have been attacked while he slept. Then there were the details that turned the case into something even more sinister, something that suggested the occult was at work. Pressed into the neck wound were a raw, unprocessed chicken wing and 2 kernels of corn. About 50 yards away, investigators found the remains of a chicken that had been slaughtered and left in the grass. Fingerprints identified the body within days, but contemporary press coverage was thin to say the least. Detectives had no witnesses, no weapon, no motive, and a crime scene that suggested something ritualistic. The San Francisco Police Department had an intelligence unit, and in it an officer named Sandy Gallant. When Jonestown ended in November 1978 with more than 900 dead, the fallout landed hard in San Francisco. The People's Temple had run its operation out of a building on Geary Boulevard, and it fell to Gallant to handle the department's local investigations in the aftermath. Almost by accident, that work made her the closest thing the SFPD had to an expert on fringe religious movements. It also taught her a lesson that would define the rest of her career. Dismissing a strange belief system because it sounds absurd is a mistake a city can pay for. So when a body turned up with food offerings packed into the wound, the case found its way to her desk. She didn't pretend to know what the scene meant, but she was determined to find out, and she started making calls. One of those calls went to Dade County, Florida, where a forensic pathologist named Charles Wetley worked in the Miami medical examiner's office. Miami in 1981 was still absorbing the roughly 125,000 Cubans who'd arrived in the Mariel boat lift the year before. If you've seen Scarface, as I have many times, that's the historical backdrop for how Tony Montana ends up in Florida. But I digress. Wheatley had begun cataloging something his colleagues elsewhere had never seen: ritual objects, animal remains, and sometimes human bones were turning up in forensic contexts connected to Afro-Caribbean religions. At the time, he was one of the only people in American forensic science paying attention to this new trend. 2 years later, he'd co-author one of the first forensic papers ever published in the United States on the subject. Wheatley was careful about distinctions, and I think it's necessary to go into them a bit further here. Santeria, the faith that grew from African religions blended with Catholicism in Cuba, is a belief whose offerings involve fruit, candles, and sometimes animals, chickens among them. Most practitioners of Santeria will swear that nothing in the mainstream of the belief calls for the usage of human remains. But there was a related tradition called Palo Mayombe, rooted in Congolese practice, whose darker branches worked with human remains. These are typically taken from graves under the cover of darkness, rather than from the living. Its central object was a consecrated cauldron, and among the things a practitioner might keep inside was a human skull or a human brain. Out of those conversations, a theory took shape that was rooted in this occult practice. The chicken and the corn resembled the kind of offering made to Elegua, the deity associated with crossroads and doorways. Corn in particular is among the traditional offerings left for him, and the missing head suggested someone building toward a ritual that mainstream practitioners would never touch. As Gallant later laid out the framework, the head would be worked with for 21 days. Then the practitioner would spend another 21 days sleeping close to it and to the cauldron while its power was drawn out. On the 42nd day, with the cycle finished, the head would be discarded close to the place it had been taken from. Count 42 days forward from February 8th, and you land on March 22nd. Sandy Gallant and her partner assembled a report based on the theory, walking through what had likely been done with the head and when it would come back, and they sent it down to detectives. What they got back was ridicule, and Gallant later recalled that the investigators laughed at her openly. The chief of detectives thought that she had lost her mind and questioned why her team had wasted resources on such a silly theory. Nobody was about to authorize surveillance on a city park because Gallant consulted a pathologist on the other side of the country about a religion nobody in the building could spell. And that's where things stood. February ended. March wore on, and the file appeared like it would go cold forever. Given the frosty reception she received, nobody was watching Alvord Lake on March 22, 1981. She admitted years later that even she and her partner weren't out there running surveillance on the day their own report had pointed. This perhaps tells you something about how much faith she had put in her own occult theory, but the head came back anyway, just as she predicted. On March 22nd, in the weeds near the water, under a bush a short distance from where the body had lain, there was a decomposing human head, 42 days to the day. It was a Sunday, the same day of the week the body had been found, and accounts differ on who came across it first. The most popular version has Sandy and her partner spotting it on a pass through the park that day, but it looks like this may have been a dramatic flair added to the case. Whatever actually happened, it was clear that no surveillance was placed on the park at the time the head was dumped there. Whoever carried the head into that park, past the joggers and dog walkers and the traffic on Stanyon Street, did it as invisibly as they'd done everything else. The killing of Leroy Carter was never solved, and no suspect was ever named. No arrest was ever made, and the physical evidence belongs to an era before modern forensics. Carter's remains were eventually laid to rest in Alexandria National Cemetery in Pineville, Louisiana, near where he was born. It was a veteran's burial for a man his city had barely noticed while he was alive, a man who was so invisible in life that no photographs of him survived. Sandy Gallant's career, on the other hand, was transformed by her absolutely stunning prediction. On the strength of the Carter case, she became one of the first police specialists in ritual and occult crime in the country. Through the 80s, she lectured and consulted for departments across the United States, fielding calls from officers who had strange scenes of their own. Those same years produced the Satanic Panic, when daytime talk shows convinced much of America that devil-worshipping crime networks were operating everywhere. Gallant occupied an odd position in all of it, cited by believers as proof that occult crime was real. She warned departments against the alarmist urge to pin every strange case on some organized occult movement. Critics of occult crime policing have argued, fairly, that despite her warnings, she helped inflate a moral panic. What they've never explained away is the case that started it, because the Carter file doesn't rest on rumors or questionable recovered memories. It rests on a report that predicted exactly when and where a man's head would reappear. Despite the accurate prediction, no theory has ever offered an answer to who did it and whether Carter was chosen for a specific reason. Some have even speculated that the occult framing of the case may have been the deliberate work of a serial killer who wanted to provide a smokescreen for what he had done. Personally, I think this is somewhat unlikely, given that information on the rituals involved wasn't easily accessible information in the era before the internet. As for what I think happened, given the timelines involved and the evidence at the scene of the crime, I strongly believe that this was a ritualistic attack. Unfortunately, though, that brings us no closer to getting justice for Leroy Carter Jr. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with my usual reminder to turn on all notifications so you know exactly when I drop new content. Also remember to drop a quick comment saying what you like to do while you watch or listen to my channel. Also, quick programming note. I've been putting out a bit less content than usual lately, and it's because I've been working on a screenplay. It's now done, and if anything ever comes of it, you'll all be the first to know. In the first days of April 1989, a pickup truck came up on a federal drug checkpoint on the highway west of Matamoros, Mexico, and drove straight through it. The young man at the wheel wasn't fleeing from anybody, because as far as he was concerned, there was nobody to flee from. He believed the armed agents standing at that roadblock couldn't see him, and he'd been promised as much by a man his family paid a great deal of money to make it true. So the agents did something unusual that afternoon, and instead of running the truck down, they followed it, out along the dirt roads, to a cattle ranch called Santa Elena. Because of that decision, they were about to solve the disappearance of an American college student named Mark Kilroy. What the federales would discover would rock and shock two nations and uncover one of the most disturbing occult criminal networks ever documented. Mark was 21 in the spring of 1989, a pre-med student at the University of Texas at Austin with a genuine shot at becoming a doctor. He'd grown up in Santa Fe, Texas, a town on the highway between Houston and Galveston. He was the older of two sons born to James Kilroy, a chemical engineer, and his wife Helen. He'd played basketball at Santa Fe High, finished near the top of his class, and struck nearly everyone as someone who was going places. That March, Mark and three friends he'd grown up with, Bradley Moore, Bill Huddleston, and Brent Martin, loaded up for the trip every Texas student seemed to be making that week. They drove down to South Padre Island on Friday, March 10th, checked into a hotel, and joined a crowd of spring breakers that swelled into the tens of thousands. And about 25 miles south of the island sat Brownsville, the border, and the Gateway International Bridge. On the far side of that bridge was Matamoros, where the drinking age was 18, and the bars on Avenida Alvaro Obregón ran loud until the early morning. Walking across for the night was practically a spring break tradition, and thousands of students did it, night after night, and essentially all of them came back. On the night of Monday, March 13th, the four friends crossed into Matamoros for the second evening in a row. They parked on the American side around 10:30 and walked over the bridge. They drank at a bar called Los Sombreros, moved on to another spot up the strip, and sometime before 2 in the morning, they decided to head back toward the bridge. The group got strung out along the crowded sidewalk, the way groups do at that hour, and Moore and Martin drifted ahead. Bill Huddleston stepped off the pavement to relieve himself behind a tree, and Mark waited for him on the sidewalk near a gift shop. He was talking to a girl the boys recognized from a contest back on the island. Huddleston was gone for maybe 2 minutes, but when he stepped back out, Mark wasn't there. None of them panicked, because there was nothing obvious to panic about. They figured he'd walked ahead, or met someone, or gotten swept along in the crowd toward the bridge. Even so, they searched the strip until roughly 4:30 in the morning, then crossed back over, half expecting to find him asleep at the hotel. He wasn't there either, and later that day, concern really started to set in, so they reported him missing. What actually happened on that sidewalk took weeks of confessions to reconstruct. A young man had approached Mark in the crowd, friendly and casual, nothing to fear. Moments later, he was being wrestled toward a pickup truck. Mark broke loose and ran, and he nearly made it, but a second vehicle cut him off about 2 blocks down. He was forced into handcuffs, stuffed inside the truck, and driven west out of the city. The men who took him had been sent into town that night with one instruction, and notably, it had nothing to do with Mark Kilroy in particular. They'd been told to bring back an American male, no further instructions, anyone would do for their purposes. The search that followed was bigger than anyone expected, and the reason was partly bureaucratic. An American had vanished on Mexican soil, which normally means jurisdictional paralysis, but Mark's uncle, Ken Kilroy, worked for the U.S. Customs Service. Through him, the case landed on the desks of people who could actually move the case forward. The family papered both sides of the border with flyers. A reward climbed to $15,000, and on March 26th, the case aired on a national true crime program. None of it produced Mark, and reported sightings went nowhere. The Mexican police shrugged at first, and when the pressure grew, they bristled and went quiet. Disturbingly, young men had been disappearing around Matamoros for the better part of a year. They were laborers and small-time drug traffickers, and their cases had generated almost no attention at all. In early April, Mexican federal police were running anti-drug checkpoints on the highways out of Matamoros, and a pickup went through one of them without stopping. The agents tailed it to Rancho Santa Elena, a scrubby working ranch roughly 20 miles west of the city, and began watching the place. The driver was Serafin Hernandez Garcia, and he's the reason the story you're hearing exists. He was 20 years old, an American citizen who'd grown up mostly around Houston and enrolled, of all things, as a law enforcement major at Texas Southmost College in Brownsville. Also, just as a quick aside, I like the literalness of that name because Texas Southmost College is quite literally the southmost college in Texas. Serafin's family ran a pot smuggling operation that had been moving loads across the river for years. When investigators later asked him why he'd driven past a federal checkpoint in plain sight, his answer, by every account, was matter of fact. He believed he was invisible, and as far as he was concerned, the police couldn't see him. And even if they somehow could, their bullets couldn't touch him. This was because the man his family worked for had performed the ceremonies that made it so, and with his occult powers, this man had altered reality. On April 9th, the federales moved in to shut down the operation, and let's just say they were about to stumble into something darker than they bargained for. They arrested Serafin, his uncle Elio Hernandez Rivera, two other members of the operation, and the ranch caretaker, a man named Domingo Reyes Bustamante. The initial haul looked like a routine drug bust: marijuana, guns, and a small fleet of vehicles. Then Reyes, the caretaker, who allegedly had no idea what his employers actually did, was shown a set of photographs. He pointed at one and mentioned that he'd seen, quote, "that young gringo" at the ranch a few weeks back, handcuffed in the rear of a Suburban. He'd fed the kid breakfast at dawn, eggs and bread and water, because nobody else had thought to. The photograph was of Mark Kilroy, and it was the first confirmation in 26 days that anyone outside his abductors had laid eyes on him. Under interrogation, and Mexican interrogation in 1989 was not a gentle process, the suspects began to talk. What they described was so far outside anything the officers expected that the questioning kept stalling. They talked about ceremonies at the ranch and a godfather down in Mexico City, about protection bought with blood. And they showed no particular remorse, discussing the whole thing with the calm of men describing routine farm work. On April 11th, police drove Serafin back out to Santa Elena, and he walked them to a patch of ground in the corral, marked by a length of wire sticking up out of the soil. The digging started that morning, with the arrested men themselves put to work on the shovels, which strikes me as somewhat odd. After all, detectives didn't know the exact magnitude of what they would find there, and it was always possible the men could destroy evidence in the dig. Regardless, by mid-afternoon there were 12 bodies laid out in a row, and by the time the excavation finished, the count at the ranch had reached 15. Most of the dead were Mexican men, some connected to the drug trade, some apparently taken almost at random off the roads. Several had been shot, others bore machete wounds, and nearly all of them showed signs of something ritualistic having occurred. Now, I'm not going to get into the gruesome details of what happened to Mark, but I do have to mention that all remnants of his brain were gone. Not far from the graves stood a tar paper shack the men called the Temple, and inside it police found an iron kettle. It was holding a stew of blood, sticks, a roasted turtle, a goat's head, and human remains, including Mark's brain. Around it sat smaller cauldrons crusted with pennies and bones, melted candles, cigar butts, and bottles of cheap cane liquor. The scene was so disgusting, so vile, so otherworldly, that some of the federales flatly refused to go inside. The godfather the suspects kept naming was Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo, and by the time police learned who he was gone. Quite a questionable first name, because he was 26, born in Miami in 1962 to a Cuban family, and raised partly in Puerto Rico. From childhood, he was steeped in occult traditions, reportedly by his own mother, and was familiar with Santeria and Palo Mayombe. The central object of Palo is the Naganga, a consecrated cauldron worked with remains, often robbed from graves. Whatever else disturbing that can be said about its darker branches, its practitioners generally weren't out abducting college students. What Constanzo built was his own invention, essentially a protection racket built upon this Afro-Cuban theology. Costanzo was described as strikingly handsome, worked for a time as a model, and in 1984 he moved to Mexico City. He initially set up shop as a tarot reader in the fashionable Zona Rosa district, and initially he was about as legitimate as these operations can be. Within a couple of years, he'd assembled a paying clientele of entertainers, businessmen, drug traffickers, and, notably, police commanders. They were all buying ritual cleansings and supernatural insurance at extraordinary prices. His ceremonies escalated from fruit and roosters to goats, and eventually, investigators came to believe, to people. A string of unsolved ritual slayings around Mexico City were later laid at his feet, though how many were actually his work is an open question. He also collected followers, among them his bodyguard and companion Martin Quintana, a young enforcer everyone knew as El Dubi, and a woman who became his second in command. Her name was Sarah Aldrete, and she remains the hardest person in this story to explain. She was in her mid-20s, a Matamoros native who crossed the bridge every day to attend Texas Southmost College, the same campus as Seraphine. She was an honors student, an athlete, 6'1", and strikingly pretty, popular with her professors, a nominee for a student who's who list. On the Mexican side of the river, the cult knew her as La Madrina, the godmother. Constanzo had reportedly engineered their first meeting in 1987, targeting her because her boyfriend at the time was plugged into the Matamoros trafficking world. One of her reported tools was a tape of The Believers, a 1987 Hollywood thriller about wealthy New Yorkers sacrificing people for power. New members watched it over and over, under the belief that the film was actually some sort of occult instruction manual. The Matamoros connection ran through the Hernandez family, a smuggling clan that had lost its most capable brother to a shooting in 1987 and had been drifting ever since. Constanzo offered them contacts and, above all, literal magic that he claimed would make them untouchable. In exchange for roughly half the proceeds of the family's smuggling business, he performed the ceremonies that would give them superhuman powers. They would be literally invisible to the police, and physically beyond the reach of rivals' bullets. Elio Hernandez was even ordained a sort of executioner priest, marked with ritual brands Constanzo carved into him with a heated knife. The sacrifices at the ranch began sometime in 1988, and each one fed the Nganga, the Palo Crucible. But here's the thing about that kind of insurance that anyone who has ever had a policy knows. The premiums always go up. In March 1989, Constanzo reportedly decided the cauldron required something stronger than the usual victims. He ordered his men to bring him an American, a white college student, a person whose mind, he's said to have believed, would confer a sharper kind of protection. The men drove into the spring break crowds and came back with the 21-year-old who happened to be standing alone for 2 minutes. Mark spent the night handcuffed at the ranch, and at dawn the caretaker fed him. Later that same day, Constanzo arrived, and Mark was taped across the eyes and mouth and led into the shed. The confessions describe what was done there in more detail than any family should ever have to hear, and out of respect, I'm not going to repeat it. When the graves opened on April 11th, the story detonated and news outlets from around the world were reporting on the satanic rituals that took place at the ranch. Very strictly speaking, they weren't explicitly satanic rituals, but when you're doing what these guys were doing, it's a word that conveys the occultic evil of their acts very well. The news coverage made Constanzo the most wanted man in Mexico and made him, for a time, a figure of worldwide infamy. He'd already run, shipping out to Mexico City with Aldrete, Quintana, El Dubi, and a few other goons. He shuttled between hideouts before settling into a rented apartment on a street called Rio Sena, and for weeks the manhunt ground on. Then, on the afternoon of May 6th, 1989, uniformed officers appeared on the block, reportedly on business that had nothing to do with the case at all. Constanzo saw them from the window and concluded his occult protection had run out. Rather than waiting to determine what was actually going on, he decided in that moment to open fire with a literal machine gun. The shootout that followed lasted somewhere close to 45 minutes, and it ended strangely, even by the standards of this story. As police closed in, Constanzo began burning fistfuls of cash on the stove and hurling coins and bills out the window into the street. Then, out of time, he handed El Dubi the weapon and gave his last order. The Godfather was not going to prison. El Dubi balked, and Constanzo struck him across the face and told him he'd suffer in hell for disobedience. So Constanzo and Martin Quintana stood together in a closet, and El Dubi sprayed it with a hail of lead. When police breached the apartment moments later, they found the two men slumped inside and took Sarah Aldrete, the honors student, into custody along with the rest. El Dubi drew 30 years for the deaths in the closet as well as his other crimes. In 1994, Sarah Aldrete was sentenced to 62 years for the killings at the ranch, and Elio, Serafine, and two other members drew 67 apiece. Aldrete has insisted from the beginning that she was a captive of Constanzo's rather than a lieutenant, and that she never witnessed a single ceremony. The men's confessions and the recruits who'd been handed her movie have kept most investigators unpersuaded. A couple of named suspects in Mark's abduction reportedly stayed fugitives for decades after, though whether they're still alive or not is an unsolved mystery in itself. The ranch got its own ending, and about 2 weeks after the exhumations, the federales returned to Santa Elena with gasoline and burned it flat. Nobody framed that fire as ordinary police procedure, and nobody had to, since everyone was just happy to have a site that was home to so much evil cleansed with flame.